Welcome to this Killick Explains video. This week I want to do something I don't do too often, and that is to quote Daniel Craig, the current James Bond, paraphrase him at least. What he said reasonably recently, which has stirred some debate in the media amongst other places, is that he disapproves of inheritances. He doesn't believe in them, and he doesn't plan to leave much of his huge fortune earned through movies and so on to children. Now that gave me the excuse to run a timely poll, if you like, to see how many people agree with that view. So the answers I offered were, predictably, do you basically agree with Daniel Craig's view on inheritance? Do you take the opposite view? Or do you think the truth lies somewhere in the middle? Now, first of all, to those poll results. So, Daniel Craig disapproves of inheritance on principle. As for you, I offered the same view, and that attracted 15% of the votes. I offered people the chance to say I hold the opposite view to the current James Bond, and that was 31.3%. But the winning view, perhaps not surprisingly, was my view actually lies somewhere in between, and that was 53.8%. So the majority of people think their view lies between the two extremes of I completely disapprove of inheritance and I totally approve of it. Now, for the in-betweeners, I guess I could probably quote Warren Buffett legitimately here. I know I quote him a lot, but he said essentially he'd like to leave his kids enough to do anything, but not so much that they end up doing nothing. But it's a tricky balance to strike. And whilst a lot of literature, if you like, emanating from the media and from wealth planning departments and so on tends to focus on how you leave assets tax effectively, it's quite important, of course, to decide, first of all, where you want those assets to go. And I suppose for most people, the alternatives include children, the wider family, carers perhaps, friends. That's one fairly large group. For many people, children, direct offspring will come at the top of the list. Things obviously get more complicated potentially emotionally and financially where people have remarried and so on. I won't deal with that directly here. Then there's the possibility of leaving money to charity, which I'll come back to briefly in a moment. And the third option is to leave it to the government. Now you can do that indirectly, if that makes sense, because any death estate that someone leaves behind is normally taxed at 40%. So there's a large chunk going straight away to the government. And there are people out there who believe that actually the government should take its fair share. Their children may not be amongst them and grandchildren, but nonetheless, that is a bona fide view. Now, two further issues I'd like to consider in this short video. What are the kind of pros and cons, very briefly, it's a huge topic, of leaving what can be in some families fairly sizable amounts to children and or grandchildren? Well, on the plus side, many people feel it's the most natural thing to do. They've worked hard to earn wealth. They've worked hard to provide for their family, perhaps different generations thereof, if they've got sufficient capital and can also look after themselves. There's a security element to it, people wanting to keep money within the family one way or another. And also there's the aspect of, well, where else am I going to give it? Some people do not believe that large charities in particular are efficient users of capital. That's a view, and the government is the same. Some people would rather not give their money to the government on political principle. But on the flip side, there are people who actually think the opposite, and it's perfectly valid, it's personal choice at the end of the day. They don't want their children to rest on their laurels, assuming they will simply inherit money and therefore not have to ever worry about earning it. They worry that their children may get targeted by people who suddenly spot that they've got money and so on. It can reduce motivation all the way down the tree. Grandchildren coming into large trusts, for example, may not study as hard as they otherwise would. And there are people who think that on principle it's unfair. Basically, why should even your own offspring, grandchildren, children and so on start with a huge financial advantage? Now, there's no right answer, and I don't want to pretend that I have a magic answer, but that's the first part of the debate, if you like, is do I want to leave money to children and grandchildren? Will I be in a position to do so financially? Have I put my own life vest on first, as I put it? And how much will be the right amount to give? Now, naturally, once people have taken the decision, let's say, that they do want to leave something to subsequent generations, then you get into the thorny issue of how best to do it in an inheritance tax efficient way. Inheritance tax being the tax on death that most people worry about trying to minimise if they can. And again, to summarise a huge amount of work here, if you like, and I've done videos on all the topics I'm about to mention, and I'll give you a reference at the end, there are various ways you can reduce your estate in a way that brings it below the thresholds for inheritance tax. Very crudely speaking, £325,000 per person, so a couple can easily double that, plus a principal private residence exemption that can bring an exempt estate up to nearer £1 million. So, how do you get below that level whilst you're still alive, if you like? Well, there are various gifts that can be made, regular gifts out of income, subject to an affordability test, for example, and then potentially exempt transfers, that is giving away assets, ideally at least 7 years before death, and that potentially completely exempts them from inheritance tax. It means they leave the death estate. Other ways of potentially mitigating inheritance tax include gifts in consideration of marriage, gifts to charities and political parties, and these are all subject to individual rules and limits, as you'd expect. And then these days there is saving into a private pension. Those are now fairly tax efficient because, once again, they normally fall outside of a death estate for inheritance tax purposes, unlike individual savings accounts, by the way, so just be careful there. The government have not levelled that particular playing field yet. And then finally, trusts. Now, trusts can be complex. There are tax implications to setting up trusts. It is completely wrong for anyone to suggest that by creating a trust and putting assets inside it, you may wave a magic wand and suddenly you escape from things like inheritance tax. That's not the case. But nonetheless, simple, otherwise known as bare trusts, or more complex arrangements, such as discretionary trusts, can be a way to effectively shield assets from tax, or at least reduce the amount of tax that they attract. So there you have it, an interesting debate. Daniel Craig's not the first person to have raised the issue of whether inheritance is a good idea, whether or not in principle it's fair, and so on. And for those people who've made up their minds on that debate, there are a number of different ways of subsequently trying to create a tax efficient structure by which wealth can be passed down to children and or grandchildren. Now, to find out more about a lot of the topics I've skirted over here, please do try our comprehensive educational library, killick.com/learn. And if you'd like copies of my free guides, a number of which deal with tax efficient saving and investing, later life costs, what to do if you're trying to deal with an estate, for example, then do please ping me an email, editor@killick.com, and I'll be happy to organise copies for you.